Now, before we begin, I just gotta take care of some really super important business real quick. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Nah, I'm only joking. It's not an S-tier game.
Please, no!
Yeah,
no!
there we go.
No! No!
Welcome, bearers of the curse, to the controversial world of Dark Souls 2, the Marmite of Fromsoftware Games. And today, we're stuck on the merry-go-round of the Executioner's Chariot.
And engage in jolly cooperation.
Before we continue, I was only joking. I don't believe Dark Souls 2 was the greatest masterpiece of all time. I don't want that smoke from you lot. Please don't come for me. So let's get into it. This is another expansion from the Steamforged board game and comes with completely new boss mechanics. It comes with hollow mages and some skelly boys to deal with, and the rider and the horses are separate, so you can fight them the same way you do in the game. So first things first, let's get all these little boys primed up, shall we? Jobbed. So I'm just going to start off with painting the chariot and just focusing on all the metal parts to begin with. And to do that, I'm just going to use some lead belcher and just start applying a very light dry brush layer onto all these little metal parts. I am very interested in the Dark Souls 2 debate and why people really dislike it. I, for one, do actually enjoy the game a lot, even though I know it has flaws with, the majorly ganked up areas, too many bosses and forgettable ones at that. But I do like the setting of the game, I like the tone, I like the vibe it brings. It feels more morose and somber than other ones. I do remember one of the main gripes I had when I first ever played it was the immediate fast travel. The masterful way that Dark Souls 1 is all interconnected and the whole map connects with each other is just so magical, and when you get into Dark Souls 2 you immediately start jumping around all over the place and it feels really disconnected and it doesn't have that same feel to it. But saying that, the DLCs absolutely bring Dark Souls 2 to another level and introduce some of the coolest bosses. Fume Knight is an absolute king. Burnt Ivory King is an absolute king, But aside from that, I'm just going to now highlight some of the metals with some Ironbreaker, mainly just to look at the edge highlighting to bring them out and give it some of that metallic reflectiveness to it. And next up is the wood, and I'm just going to use some Rhinox hide to base it and just take a dry brush and do a simple dry brush job all over the wooden areas like the platform, the poles, the wheels and the spokes. Then to highlight the wood, just bring in some Mornfang Brown and dry brush on those layers to bring in the lighter wooden tones to the parts we just applied Rhinox hide. Then taking some Xandri dust, I'm going to do the same again and dry brush on the highlights onto the wood, making sure to only enhance the regions we applied Mornfang Brown to generate that little gradient. Then just with a precision brush, I'm just going to detail in the little ropes that are on the poles. To tie the wood job together, I'm going to apply a thin wash of Agrax Earthshade to give us that deep contrast, and it will settle nicely into all the little cracks in the wood. Then with some more Mornfang Brown and a fine brush, I'm going to detail in some lighter brown tones to the wheel spokes. And this is how it's shaping up so far. Now for the little straps, I'm going to paint them with some Abaddon Black. You can see that the booklet here comes with a 2-page spread of the chariot, so I'm just using that as a reference guide to what colours I'm going to be using. Then just some more Agrax Earthshade to the spokes to add that sort of darker shade to it. And then I can get painting on the wood that sits underneath the metal plates on the actual rims of the wheels. So just same as before, going from Rhinox hide to Mornfang Brown and to Xandri dust, and then using a wash of Agrax Earthshade to tie it all together. And that's how it's looking so far. With some Ironbreaker again, I'm just going to detail in these little spiky bits that are on the poles here. And then with that, I'm going to try do a rust effect. Now, I don't actually own any rust texture stuff, and I really should purchase some because it will go a long way with Dark Souls models. So instead, I'm going to try and create my own using some Trollslayer Orange and using this old Citadel base brush. I'm going to kind of try and use it to stipple the orange around the metal to try and replicate the rusty tone. Stippling is that sort of like dabbing, you can see, like sort of like just gently dotting it around, just to try and make it look a bit more rusty. And that's kind of how the rust is looking at the moment. Now before I forget, I need to paint in this little torch that is strapped to the chariot here, so just some Xandru dust for the ropes, some Rhinox hide and some Mournfang brown for the wooden torch part. And that should just about do it for the chariot piece. Now onto the rider. Now we're going to start off with the fur material he has draped across his shoulders as if he was standing guard on a night's watch or something. And to do that, I'm going to dry brush on a layer of Mechanicus Standard Grey. Then I'm going to highlight the grey base on the fur with some Dawnstone dry paint, and again just lightly dry brush this on, making sure that most of the wet paint has been removed from the brush before doing so. And finally, to really bring out the highlights on the fur, use some Longbeard Grey and dry brush these onto the upper race parts to create those nice light highlights. We're going to be using contrast paints for the bones, so before we do that I'm going to base them with some Wraithbone, and that will go onto the exposed bone, kind of dead skin layers around, which will be on the torso, on the hands, on the arms and parts of the leg as well. I'm going to paint this glove that he has with some Rhinox hide as if they were a leather-like material, and then use some more Rhinox hide across all these draping cloth-like bits that are kind of hanging off the body. And finally, whilst we still have the Rhinox hide equipped, I'm just going to paint the handle of the scythe with it as well. Then, like we did before with the wood, I'm just going to take some more of this Mournfang brown to act as our brown midtone, and with the same precision brush, just start detailing in these nice little midtones across all the draping cloth parts that we have, and then add in the midtone detailing to the handle of the scythe as well. And then once again, it's back to Xandru dust, and I'm using this for the rope that's tied around the middle part of the scythe here. And for the cloth at the top of the scythe, I'm going to be basing it with some Mechanicus Standard Grey, making sure to keep it nice and thin as always. Then picking out some of the raised edges and surfaces of this material, I'm going to add some highlights with some Administratum Grey. Then I'm going to generate some ultra bright highlights by applying very fine strokes of Corax White to the inner parts of the light grey. Going back to the body again, I mentioned we were going to use some contrast paints on top of the Wraithbone base, so I'm just going to use some of this Skeleton Horde contrast paint, which is a really awesome paint for skeletons, and do a nice generous application across all the areas coated with Wraithbone. Then for the actual blade on top of the scythe, I'm going to attempt some basic non-metallic metal style, starting off with a base coat of Mechanicus Standard Grey. Then I'm going to apply some Corax White to the brightest areas that I want to generate the most highlight. Then bring it back down to Abaddon Black for the darkest parts, so the underside of the scythe and the little divot at the back. Then just using glazing and some Administratum mid-tone grey to start blending between these different tones till I'm happy with how it's looking. Then when I'm happy with it, I'm just adding in some little scratches with some white for effect. Then I'm going to follow that same methodology for the helmet and the iron armour on the torso. I know there are a bunch of forgettable bosses in this game, and there are a lot of bosses. I think it said there's around 32 in the main game, but there are some also like absolutely stellar bosses in the game as well that really stick out to me, like the Looking Glass Knight, the Smelter Demon. I'm still trying to forget about the run to the Blue Smelter Demon, but it still plagues my dreams. Pursuer is fun, he's not that challenging, still fun. Last Giant is pretty cool, pretty sad. The Executioner's Chariot is kind of gimmicky, but I still enjoyed it all the same. You know, I got called a Dark Souls 2 apologist in the collection video, which is hilarious, and I'll stand by that, but I don't hate the game, but it is the least good title in my opinion. But with the armour done, I'm going to go over it with some Nuln Oil for that added contrast and gloss to it. And now I'm just going to get the little rider boy attached now that he's finally painted to the chariot, and then we can move on to the horses. There we go, that's how our little dude and the chariot is looking. Not too bad. Not too bad. So these horses are just really dark and grey, so I'm just going to base coat them with some thinned down Ishan Grey and get that applied all over the horse's coat. And then like we did with the rider's fur part, I'm just going to use this Dawnstone dry paint and just dry brush on all these lighter grey midtones over that Ishan Grey base. And for the highlights, I'm just going to dry brush on some Longbeard Grey. And the handy thing with this model is that there's loads of tiny details and ridges, so that dry brushing will really bring out some of the highlights really nicely. And then for the actual hollowed flesh underneath the coat, I'm going to use some of this Rakarth flesh, which is a really nice base, as it's a nice dull dead looking skin tone, and this will go onto the legs, the under parts of the body and the parts of the face that are exposed. And the same as what we did with the leather and the wood for the chariot and the rider, I'm going to base these straps with some Rhinox hide, get some midtones of Mournfang brown on there, and highlight it with some Sandry dust before applying a wash of Agrax Earthshade. At this point my B-cam ran out of juice, but that's okay because we're at the final step anyway. So I'm just going to take some lead belcher, and I'm using this to paint on the chains that we can see are on the bridle on the horse. My girlfriend's a horse person, so I know all the terminology now. And with that, the horses are done, and that means that the boss is fully painted and ready to hit the tracks. So I'm just going to sit the chariot behind the horses and get the poles in position, not gluing them together as they both work in tandem and individually in the game. And there we are, the Executioner's Chariot, the greatest ever boss from the greatest ever game. I'm joking, please don't hurt me. Which reminds me, I'll just go back and adjust this. I think I'll ride the fence a bit and leave it here. I'll let you argue in the comments over it. But thank you all so much for watching. It's amazing that I just get to upload these videos painting characters from my favourite games, and I have such a nice collection of people watching and engaging with them. I can't thank you enough for the support. If you did enjoy today's video, please drop it a like, leave a comment, tell me what's your thoughts on Dark Souls 2. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you unbothered about it? I'm keen to know what your take is. If you're new here, why not hit the subscribe button and join the gang? I would love to have you on board. But for now, that's it from me. Peace out, gang, and don't you dare go hollow.